Hi, thanks. We'll just wait another minute for a few more people to join, and welcome everyone who's watching this live on Hasgeek TV and on YouTube and wherever else in the world you are, and to everybody who's joined the Zoom webinar as well. I'm Divij, and yeah, as you might have noted, I'm going to be presenting some of my research on automated decision making by governments, by public agencies in India, and generally trying to build some more critical conversation around AI, automated decision making, and big data. All these terms that you increasingly hear today, and particularly the very concerning and consequential contexts in which they're being used. I think it's high time that this is a conversation that really builds up in India, and that there's kind of more participation in the kind of policies and the kind of laws and the kind of technological systems that are being built around these. So just give us a minute, and I will start with a presentation of a project that I will be launching today, which is called the AI Observatory, which has been built by me and the wonderful team at Design Beku, who is also on this call. Great. So I'm going to start now. I'll just share my screen and I'll also share the website link to everybody who's here. So you can all log on to that. It will be redirected to a non-GitHub IO site soon. But for now, if you go on there, and I'll just take you through kind of how to navigate this and what it really contains, and also why I've done this project in the first place. So the project is called the AI Observatory. I think, even though I I'm always very hesitant to use the words AI or use the term AI because it gets very confusing. It's a very conflicting use, and it's not really a term of art. I prefer to use the term automated decision making systems because they kind of center, I guess, they center what AI does and why, the kind of consequential uses that it's put to. And it also centers them as kind of socio-technical systems which are embedded in very particular social and institutional and normative contexts, which is why I guess throughout this, I don't use the term AI except where it's used in policy documents or in laws. I prefer to use the term automated decision making, also because it conveys a range of sophistication of automated systems and technologies, right? From simple softwares which employ certain kinds of logic-based rules to more modern machine learning systems. They all pose similar concerns, I guess, within a particular spectrum of sophistication and particular spectrums of the kind of affordances they provide or the kind of harms that they can potentially be used for. But they largely fall within particular brackets of algorithmic systems or automated decision making. So what you're seeing here is the home page for the AI Observatory, which very briefly explains, I guess, the imperatives for why this research, why I conducted this research, and why we built this particular toolkit. So the biggest reason I think was when I started doing this as in my role as a Mozilla Fellow, was the disjunctions between the kind of grand hyperbolic claims that we were seeing um, in policy documents by the government of India, as well as the kind of claims that technology companies and others embedded within these institutions were making about how AI is going to solve, these gigantic and long-running, long-standing social problems simply by being efficient, by being non-human. And the idea was to push back against this idea that that artificial intelligence is this uh, technical solution to very complex social problems, and also that it's not a human system, in that it's something that comes from nowhere, and is able to solve problems by being completely neutral, and by being neutral and efficient in a manner which has no interaction with the kinds of social or other contexts within which it's actually embedded or within which it's working. um, Another reason for this was to kind of serve as a counter mapping exercise, right? So while we were being pushed this narrative of AI hype and AI hyperbole, we're seeing that policy is also increasingly disjunct from participation, particularly in India. The ability for people to actually see how these systems are functioning or be able to participate in them has gradually shrunk. So these decisions are made within very narrow spaces of policy, of tech policy in particular, which are kind of almost overrun by the interests of large technology corporations, or the interest of government who may want to use these systems for surveillance or for other means. Now, and a final reason I think is just that um, the it's also meant to kind of showcase that this is something that's happening, and it's a very current and real problem that's happening in India. Often, kind of the use of these systems, even though there are a lot of them, as you'll see if you go to the database later, a lot of these systems are developed by large technology companies, in the US, in the UK, or in the EU, and a lot of the conversation around AI ethics or the accountability of algorithmic systems happens, in those contexts, whether it's standard setting institutions or the kind of conversations that reach these large technology companies. It always focuses on what you could call the global north, but the same conversations are both limited in the global south, and also or in countries like India, and also aren't really reaching the same the institutions where these policies or where these technologies are made. So this was kind of an effort to indicate also to these spaces, these consequential spaces, that the systems that you're building have consequences for people in jurisdictions which you're not looking at. So it's an effort to kind of push against that narrative, and try to reclaim some of that space as well. And just an example of this is, how Microsoft and Amazon, for example, stopped selling facial recognition systems to police in the USA after the Black Lives Matter protests erupted a few months ago. But the same companies continue to sell these technologies in India. And that disjunction is very apparent, and it's quite concerning. So this is an effort to kind of to bring this conversation, to bring this lens into the conversation at a global stage as well. So the project is structured in 4 parts very broadly, and you can look at that if you go right below. And um, these little pointers over here are actually expandable modals. So if you just want to see, for example, a very short note on the method that I've tried to follow, and the definitions I've used, you can just click there. So the first and one big part of this is the mapping exercise. So I've tried to understand through desk research, through interviews with bureaucrats, with journalists, with people who are using these systems, what kind of systems are really in place, what kind of public documentation exists about these systems, including, for example, responses to RTIs, procurement documents or presentations that the government has been making at international levels, including, say, the World Bank or the WTO about these systems. So the first part is a database, which is a mapping effort. The second part is an effort to understand the legal, institutional, and technical architecture of these systems. So who are the actors and institutions, and what is the kind of context within which these systems are growing? What are the kind of databases, and what are the data modeling technologies that are used, which I think is incredibly important, not just the kinds of data that are being used, but also how those data and how those information systems are being built to serve as backbones for automated decision making. And then a note on another technical component of this, which is the algorithmic systems of the statistical models that are, the mathematical statistical models that are used to power these systems, and to basically turn particular data inputs into actionable outputs. A second part of this then goes on to talk about what the various harms, both real perceived and potential harms of using these systems are. This draws from a variety of literature, particularly in the field of fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics in machine learning or in algorithmic systems, which and specifically draws from case studies relevant to India. So, so all of the kind of the databasing effort also helped me map out how these concerns of transparency and accountability, of surveillance and profiling, of dispossession of rights and entitlements, and of discrimination are playing out within the systems being used in India. And I'll quickly get to how that is structured within the document or within the website itself. A final part of this, which is unfortunately yet to be uploaded, is talks about principles for the design and also tools for taking action against these systems. So the first part of that talks about how constitutional principles are very relevant, not just as judicial standards to review these systems once they might reach court, but also important to help aid in the design and ensuring the appropriate regulation of these systems once you start building laws and policies around them. Another part is to ensure that there's kind of greater participation in how these systems are seen, because this can't simply be an effort of a few people embedded within particular, uh, tech policy institutions or even public interest institutions. So I've tried to make an effort to, a little bit engage with with everybody who's trying to use these systems or trying to use this website to how they can, for example, use the Right to Information Act to get relevant public documentation and information about these systems, how they can use consumer protection law to maybe file a suit against a particular consequential system which is being used against them, and also some resources for strategic litigation, which I think we'll also come to in the second panel for today. I'll very quickly also take you through the database, which I guess there's multiple ways to navigate this. One is if you're concerned about a particular area in which automated decision making is being used, you can simply go here. I've mapped out a few of the areas in which it's being used. So if you want to see how ADM is being used for welfare, you can see all of these various systems. So if we go, for example, to Samagra Vedika, you can see the purpose for which it's being used, where it's being employed, what year it was deployed, kind of the relevant public documentation wherever that's available. So, and some of the other kind of news reports or what else has been written about it. And in this way, it's kind of meant to both be something that's useful as a click about. So if you're exploring this for the first time and you just want a general outlay of what's being done, or if you're interested in looking at more specific systems, then you can also you can filter it by purpose, you can filter it by year, or by the jurisdiction in which it may be used. So if you go, for example, if you want to see systems that are being used across India, broadly, so I mean, it may not be used everywhere across India, but they're developed to be used across states or developed by the government of India to be used at the central level. You can see all of these various systems here as well. Sorry, 1 second. Right. So some of the referencing is missing from the website currently. So once we add those links, you can of course see the same text in these documents. But also if you want to download the PDFs and see the references for yourself, you can do it on the home page itself. So this is the how it's essentially structured. The first, first part of this kind of talks about the laws, policies, actors, and institutions, and really the politics of AI policy in India. And I think what's particularly concerning from the data that I've gathered and the kind of research that I've done on this is how decision making is essentially being delegated to a set of private actors or to a set of actors who don't really have responsibility towards the public. So most ADM used within government is seen as a procurement problem. So it's a problem that is identified by public agencies, and then a tool is identified to solve that problem. And there's very little negotiation between the two. A tool that's developed by mostly by private companies or private companies in collaboration with a government agency, but it's ultimately used by a third-party public agency with very little knowledge about what went into that tool, or very little in terms of ways to actually go about interrogating it, or seeing what problems might arise. So if you look at the regulatory landscape for how these systems are used, and even in the systems that I've documented, almost none of them really have any kind of regulatory governance framework, from how they are procured to how they should be audited, to any kind of impact assessment about for public agencies to understand how these systems could potentially go wrong, or what kind of data should be used within these systems, or what kind of algorithm should be used. It's simply seen as a very basic problem solving approach through a technology, and I think that's very, very concerning. There are a few very specific, context specific regulations, for example, in the Aadhaar Act, but as I've also outlined here, those also end up being completely insufficient for the kinds of problems that we see coming across through automated decision making. There's also an astonishing variety of data and databases that are being used by public agencies in India. Everything from your electricity bill to your vehicle registration is going and feeding into different kinds of algorithmic systems and different kind of database models. So, the idea of making relational databases, or making linkability between databases is really catching up very, very fast. And which is why I think it's both relevant to understand the kinds of data that's going into this. So legacy data, or the kind of categories about, criminal data, or that we've tried to outline here, but also the kinds of database modeling technologies that are going into it, right? The technologies that allow for greater retrieval of information across contexts. And then this chapter is kind of an effort to understand what it means when data is retrieved across contexts, and when you shift context of particular information from one to another, and then try to merge it and try to get analytics or predictive power out of particular data points, why that's concerning and how that's happening. The next chapter is about the other technical component, which is algorithms that are used within these systems. This case study, for example, looks at the effort by the Ministry of IT a couple of years ago to build in automated censorship platforms, automated censorship within online platforms, right? And the idea was that AI can remove unlawful speech, which was a really ridiculous idea, and it again indicates the kind of techno solutionism that always comes up when these conversations about AI happen, that AI can somehow magically understand what unlawful is and what lawful is, and that it's, it doesn't really need to be relevant to our ideas about prior censorship or prior restraint, or even our ideas about how speech works within context, right? And one of my favorite quotes to really, again, understand how public agencies have been thinking about this is a quote by a bureaucrat who's responsible for the Samagra Vedika system in Telangana, who made this amazing quote about how he was asked about difficulties and biases which might emerge in machine learning algorithms, and his response was simply to say that the more data you feed into machine learning, the better it gets, which is a fairly ridiculous response in my opinion, and it really goes to show how little the people in charge of these systems are really aware about these systems, and what their potential consequences can be. A second section, and I'll very quickly run through this for 2 minutes, is about the problems in the transparency and accountability of these systems. Of course, it's always been referred to as a black box, algorithms as black box systems, but what does it really mean to be a black box? Where does that opacity arise from? So I've done a kind of review of where opacity arises, both in technical contexts, for example, the difficulty of actually knowing the kind of data that goes in, or parsing through the algorithmic statistical methods or mathematical methods that are used, but also the institutional opacity. The failure of the Right to Information Act, for example, has been a big revelation in this research. The fact that the more you try to get information out of these, you realize that this network of private development of these systems, as well as the concerns of, say, national security or privacy that are thrown up when you try to get information out of these, or trade secrets, which is another big a blockage to transparency about these systems, is really leading us into an area where we can't really question these systems because we don't know enough about them. Similarly, these systems also kind of obscure areas of accountability and responsibility, something that we saw in the Aadhaar case. And I'd urge you to read some of these case studies to really understand how accountability and transparency issues are thrown up in the Indian context. And three of the major harms, that I've outlined here, or the major blocks of, harmful consequences that are occurring here is in surveillance and policing. And policing as an institution has, really taken up very strongly the use of automated decision making, which is a very, very consequential use case right there. And particularly a growing use of these systems in welfare contexts, which started, of course, with Aadhaar, but is now kind of moving far beyond Aadhaar into the use of machine learning, into the use of different kinds of state level identification systems, which are also being used as automated decision making to identify who's a relevant beneficiary, who is potentially committing welfare fraud. And we've seen that these systems, particularly, I mean, we have experience from Aadhaar, but also we've seen in other jurisdictions like the Netherlands or the UK, how these systems tend to fail and also put the people who are most, marginalized at risk, or the people who are most dependent on state welfare at risk. And I think that's something really concerning that we need to watch out for. So that's very broadly the content on the website, and that's very broadly the project. And yeah, I hope you guys, I hope everybody who's attending here, everybody who's watching has the opportunity to kind of read through it, provide some critical feedback. This is meant to be, of course, participatory. It's meant to kind of, be a starting point for conversations about this in India. So if you have experience, interacting with these systems, or if there's something that you think is missing from the database or missing from my analysis of these systems, then please feel free to reach out to me. I've given my contact information. The last thing I just want to note that, of course, this was, an effort of an entire community, the wonderful people who have spoken to the lawyers, activists, and journalists who have interacted with, and particularly, of course, Design Beku and the team there, Padmini, Paul, Pratyush, in particular, who've really kind of, we've been working on this for the last 3 or 4 months very closely, and they've done a wonderful job. So all of the, wonderful typesetting, all of the wonderful design work that you see in the database system that's been designed, the amazing little donations that you'll see, the little characters all across the project and all across the reports as well, have been designed by Paul. And there's a very specific idea behind both, the way things have been designed and the way this narrative has been created through the illustrations, which you can also see on the homepage if you click on Map Territories and Learning Knowing, where they've kind of briefly explained what the idea behind the color scheme is, what the idea behind the illustrations is, and why it's important. So I'll stop with that, and I think we'll move on to the first panel for the day, which is building on this theme to kind of explore how automated decision-making is really working in practice in India, and why that should concern us all. So the first panelists for today are Arindrajit Basu from CIS. Hi, Arindrajit. Vidushi Marda who's at Article 19, and Padmini Remare, who I just introduced and leads the team at Design Beku. So, yeah. I hope you enjoyed clicking through that as much as you could. I know it's a bit of a short presentation, but really building on, I guess, some of the some of the points that this research threw up. I want to start with Arindrajit to I kind of talk about what the regulatory and policy landscape of automated decision making in India is. Right? Why aren't we seeing a more concerted effort towards how these systems are being used by public agencies, and really what is the policy conversation that's been happening around these systems in different sectors, from say defense to agriculture. Just quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Divij. First of all, congratulations on this observatory. I think it's a really useful tool for anyone working on AI in India, and I hope that people add to it and it really becomes a very useful repository. So I think on the regulatory ecosystem in India, I think the first word that comes to mind is enthusiasm. And I think you referred to that a little bit in the sense that there is a lot of enthusiasm among the bureaucratic establishment to create new forms of regulation for AI, because AI, or whatever the framing is an entirely new conception according to them, which offers new possibilities. And therefore, we have seen a slew of policies that have come out from across government entities and departments. Often they speak to each other in a very uncoordinated fashion. And the idea is that you mentioned one of the key ideas very clearly, that access to data and data as an economic asset for the development of these systems across sectors is something that's beneficial for society. And therefore, we need to harness this data in a manner that asserts India's sovereignty. So when you look at any digital policy ecosystem in India, I think, including artificial intelligence, the word that comes to mind is in the embellishment of Indian sovereignty. And I think the issue there is not enough attention given to the core beneficiaries of this idea of sovereignty, which should be the user. So when we speak about the regulatory landscape, it's not that there is a lack of regulatory ambition. So from the Niti Aayog itself, there have been a number of policies that have come out. Some of them do ask some the right questions. But what we need, and I think definitely more, some of that work is happening by people on this panel, Vidushi in particular, to actually study what the empirical reality is in India, what the kind of challenges that are posed, not by algorithms themselves, but by the socio-economic context in which these algorithms arise, and therefore then to see how we can create a regulatory ecosystem that works for everyone. So just to build on that, I think something that you are doing in your project, which I haven't seen spoken about enough in any policy document, is the constitution. And I think that the phrase ethics has been thrown around in policy documents. The phrase data for public good or the data for economic benefit, data marketplaces has been thrown around. But usage of specific provisions of the constitution or constitutional ethos, I have not seen it being used in any document thus far, right? Or at least in a way that applies these principles. And I just like to end with this, and which is why I think the AI Observatory is such a powerful tool, that the challenges that come with algorithms, or the ones that we associate with algorithms, they actually existed way before, or at least some version of them existed before AI became a thing. And therefore, there were, obviously, because these challenges existed, there was some thinking that people before us had put in terms of combating these challenges. And to that extent, the constitution and its related developments throughout the 7 decades that it's been a living document for, has actually solved to a certain extent some of these challenges, right? And I think that forgetting that when we are trying to create this ecosystem and not using that as the tool that actually knits regulation together, and therefore coming up with new ideas such as data marketplaces, a garage for emerging economies. There are so many regulatory ideas, I don't think I'll be able to cover all of them in 5 minutes. But rather than trying to do that and come up with new innovative regulatory techniques, it's far easier to actually cement them in the existing constitution and then build a regulatory ecosystem around that. And I think that is really what is missing from the Indian regulatory scheme. And I hope that in the next round, I'll be able to discuss some more critical ideas on how we can regulate better.
Thanks, Arindrajit. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned particularly how different, how different the kind of vision that's articulated in policy documents is from the work that's actually been, or the practice that's actually happening on the ground. And with that, I kind of wanted to move to Vidushi, because you've done so much, ethnographic work on how these systems are being implemented and this stark difference between the hyperbole and the reality. So if you could just speak about your work and what it really implies for, I guess, regulation or policy going ahead on ADMS in India.
Yeah, thanks, Divij, and thanks, Arindrajit. I found myself nodding vigorously to everything you said. It's a big plus one on that. I think the first thing that I want to say when we talk about like automated decision-making systems on the ground is that there's a huge presumption of usefulness before it's demonstrated, right? So there's a huge presumption that having predictive policing in Delhi will reduce crimes against women. There's a huge presumption that having smart sanitation in Pune will make the smart city a better place for everyone to live in. And the way in which policy has been positioned and the way in which these systems have been positioned, especially over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, is that it's increasingly difficult to question the premise. It's almost like you're being annoying when you question the premise, right? So there's an assumption of legality, there's an assumption of usefulness, there's an assumption of efficiency, which I find really problematic, but also really important to kind of study. And it can feel almost anticlimactic for that to be the end finding of a huge project. But I think it's an important point of evidence to start building on. And the second was that I think the use of ADM systems, as you call them, which I like, is that I often think of them as like a PR management tactic, and that could be overly, I admit that could be overly cynical of me, but I often find that these systems are being used when public agencies want to seem like they're doing something. So what we found in Delhi was that following the horrific rape in December of 2012, there was a need to show that work was being done. There was a need to show that, the police was taking this seriously. And so they came up with CMAPs and they came up with, all sorts of tracking and hotspot mapping initiatives after that. So I think the public management aspect of things is far bigger than we give credit for in our policy documents and in our legal analysis and things like that. And I think one of the ways in which I saw this really manifest was when I did joint work with Malvika Prasad, studying smart sanitation in Pune. So what we found there was that, smart sanitation was like, as we know, Pune is like a champion smart city, right? Like it's thought of as one of the poster children for why we should have, or we should aspire to smart cities everywhere. And when we started studying smart sanitation, the first thing we realized was that the reality was far more sobering than the documents that we were given. So it wasn't like AI or machine learning being used to help with something. It was mostly just sensors being put in public bathrooms. But I think what was more important, and I think the biggest learning for me from that entire process, was that the use of ADM systems by public agencies means that public service delivery, such as sanitation, quickly goes from being a function of public agencies to becoming a business use case. So when we tried to get sort of information about, where do these smart sanitation systems get embedded? What are the processes by which you figure this out? And we were hoping to find something like, okay, each municipality or each section of society or whatever. And the thing that we found was that the driving force of having ADM systems was whether it made business sense or not. So you are looking at, fundamental rights that are now suddenly being dictated and allowed or disallowed just by virtue of a business's bottom line, which I think is, again, one of the really worrying aspects of having these kinds of systems kind of introduced and pushed into public life without the legal and technical deliberation that it deserves. So I'll stop there and happy to talk more in the next round.
Thanks, Sudeshi. And yeah, I mean, that's really something that, really comes out in a lot of this research or a lot of studies about this is, who does this kind of, who do these norms of efficiency work for, right? Like when you're looking at when the outcome of all of these processes is cost cutting or saving on welfare costs or saving on government administration, who does it end up working for? And I wanted to kind of expand that question and come to you, Padmini, to kind of talk about, what are the normative assumptions that these, both the technical systems as well as the kind of different contexts in which they're embedded, like smart cities, and the assumptions about efficiency and safety, who do they end up working for? What kind of biases and what kind of, assumptions do they reproduce? And where can this kind of turn harmful for the people for whom the city, for whom, the government is supposed to work?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I'm going to echo some of what both Vidushi and Orindrajit has said. I think first, I might kind of review my interest in this is not only to do with Divij's wonderful website, which we've had the privilege of working on, but I've also been working with Professor Ayana Datta, who's at University College London, on a project called Gendering the Smart City, which has been going for around 2 years now. And the whole intention and the reason why we felt that we really needed to do this project is to foreground the lack of attention that is paid to gender in any kind of policy around smart cities. Which is kind of an astounding kind of omission, because obviously cities are experienced by different demographics in different ways, and the way that somebody who is a marginal and of a different gender, kind of fundamentally determines your experience of the city. And so I think, as Vidushi very correctly said, I think a lot of these kind of moves that are kind of visibly taken by the government, and we all kind of are also aware that many of these kind of contracts are public-private kind of relationships that kind of allow for these technologies to enter the public domain. It's very much kind of a very top-down kind of way of thinking about what the citizen needs or what the city needs. There's a piece of work that I kind of really always kind of come back to when I'm talking about this, which was written in 2014 about, it was a kind of a study in kind of India, Brazil, South Africa, and Peru, looking at how knowledge management works when it comes to informing policies around smart cities. And I think one of the most important things that that kind of document revealed was that when we have conversations about mobility and fastness and these qualities that determine the smart city, the whole focus is on economic growth and development, obviously, and how to provide facilities specifically for a very middle class lifestyle. So when these conversations happen kind of both in the public and the private sector that purport to be participatory, and we hear that a lot, and it's interesting for those of us who kind of work in the design space, because there's obviously been a kind of wholesale embracing of design thinking, which purports to kind of values such as empathy, such as participatory processes, which are then kind of used to, in a sense, whitewash the fact that these participatory processes are often just box ticking exercises, because they are only speaking to, and the participants in those conversations are the middle class and people of privilege and who are educated enough to actually participate in those conversations. So there's very little kind of proactive kind of engagement with communities who are much more likely to be affected, so say slum communities or marginalized communities for whom the city is a very different place. And so because of this lack of engagement, it's no surprise that the systems that are being built kind of valorize the certain kind of values that are embedded at the heart of the smart city, which only, as we well know, kind of only works to the advantage of a certain segment of society and not the rest. So I can talk a little bit more about this as we go on.
Thanks, Padmini. And yeah, that's wonderful to kind of just link how the social and institutional contexts link up to a lot of the, the technical debates maybe that have been occurring in this space as well, right? The idea that, say even the Aadhaar fingerprint matching system underperformed on particular demographics, or as we're seeing machine learnings grow in biometric identification, we've seen how that doesn't work for particular ethnicities, or rather underperforms by a particular metric or measurement of performance. It underperforms in particular ethnicities, and that's, yeah, it's really fascinating to see this convergence in conversations in all of these spaces. So we're going to move on to the second part of this panel, I guess, to really think about ideas for where we can go from here. I know it's definitely not I'm always a little hesitant to say that we should always have a solution to once we identify these problems, but I think it is necessary to kind of start thinking about what lens we can apply once you've identified the problem, or where we can start moving towards, or what kind of goals we want to move towards as well. So I thought for the next panel we can talk about what are the principles that we should think about in terms of regulation and design of these systems. And I'd like to start with you, Vidushi, again. You've done work on both constitutional law approaches to this, as well as international human rights approaches to automated decision making and AI. So if you could just talk about how principles of human rights and constitutional values can really inform, and how it would really play out in practice when they inform regulation and design of these systems.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to take a stab at that. I think the first thing I want to say right at the outset is that there's there's often talk about, what kind of new rights do we need? So do we need a right against automated decision making, which we have now in the GDPR to some extent. But kind of bringing that conversation back to the extent to which current laws can apply and current regulations can apply is something that I find hard to do on the ground, especially when you're talking to policymakers, especially when you're talking to businesses who are incentivized to roll this out under the presumption of a legal vacuum, right? So I think the first really important step is to think about how first principles of constitutional law and regulation, whether it's consumer protection or competition law, can actually apply. So as you said, I've done work on human rights and thinking about how human rights standards, international human rights standards, but also, human rights standards in the national context can inform the design, development, and deployment of automated decision-making systems. And I often give this analogy of a room, right? So I think that human rights should be the absolute minimum requirement below which no ADM system should go. So it's not to say that human rights are a checklist, and if you can tick off the checklist, then you're good to go, because that would kind of defeat the whole process of trying to ensure that the societal impact of these systems is not disastrous. So it's not a checklist, it's just a minimum requirement, it's the floor, right, of this regulatory room that I'm trying to build in 4 minutes. So if we think of that as the floor, then ethics would be the ceiling, right? And this kind of preempt some of those conversations around ethics versus rights and ethics versus regulation, because they both have their place, and they shouldn't be conflated with each other, because the minute they are, you actually defeat the purpose of both. So if you have human rights as the floor and you have ethics as the ceiling, ethics tells us how far we should go, what we should aim towards, what we should be looking towards, what is a legitimate aim and what isn't, and things like that. That can be dictated by the ceiling. And then I think of the walls and the way in which you reach the walls and the ceiling as being the technical, ethical standards of fairness, accountability, transparency, right? So because if we work on, say, for example, fairness, with an assumption that human rights standards would dictate ABC things, and this is a little overly simplistic, but just bear with me for a little while. And if the ethical standards to which we're aspiring to are the ceiling, then you can actually give us ways in which to reach both via the technical formulations of ethics, whether it's fairness, accountability, or transparency. So I think that is just in terms of frameworks and how we think of them working together. It's much more complicated. It's not a matter of choice. It's actually a matter of figuring out how they work together. After I finish talking, I'll drop a link in of a publication that actually talks specifically about this and how we think of the limitations of each of these frameworks and things like that. And another thing, and I'll stop after this, is to just kind of talk about, I think data protection gets a lot of airtime when we talk about ADN systems, as it should, right? Because it is a fundamental piece of this regulatory puzzle. But I think often what is overlooked is other frameworks like consumer protection or competition law. Even, I don't know if intellectual property would help. I haven't really studied that, but definitely consumer protection and competition law as frameworks are really useful. When I was doing some work on China, I found that when we're trying to get companies to behave in a certain way or to, respect user privacy, Alibaba in Jan of 2018 had this massive leak. And of course, the knee-jerk reaction is to say this is bad for privacy. This is horrible for individual privacy, autonomy and all. We can go down the data protection route, which is fine. I just don't know if it would have worked with a Chinese company that doesn't necessarily think about rights and data in the same way that, a human rights organization would. So what consumer protection groups in China actually did were they pursued a case against Alibaba, not to say anything about privacy, but to talk about consumer trust and to say that you violated consumer trust. And as a consumer, I don't have reason to trust you anymore. So fix the problem, pay your fines, and then we can move on. And that actually worked. So I think some amount of creativity also and reading the room, so to speak, is really important when we think about regulation, because it can't just be confined to, the main frameworks that we've already talked about. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you raised a really important point about, I guess, the mix of first principles and different regulatory approaches, right? The fact that, and it's, I guess we'll discuss this in the second panel more, the fact that people are increasingly waking up to the fact that, you can start applying existing legal principles, existing constitutional principles, to challenge some of the, the legal vacuums within which these systems are implemented. And then you realize that there are existing principles and standards that exist to which they have to be held to account, even if there isn't a clear standard of regulatory governance, even if there isn't a specific law for AI. But on that note, I wanted to turn to Arindrajit and also ask him, you've done some research on, kind of talking about how policy should incorporate a range of different regulatory responses. I just wanted you to expand on that a little bit and speak specifically from the standpoint of regulatory governance, right? Like, what does good regulation look like? Is it, do we need an AI law? Will it achieve anything, or should we leave it to sectoral efforts? How do we go about bridging that gap?
Thanks, Divij. And I think a lot of what I was going to say has already been covered by Vidushi exceptionally well as always. So thanks to her for that. But I think the first point that I wanted to make is that when we regulate, and this is a point that I was making earlier as well, is that it's important not to get caught up in a narrative. And right now, the narrative seems to be enthusiasm about asserting the country's economic sovereignty. And it is important, therefore, when we actually take a step back and think about regulatory governance, to poke holes in that narrative and try to improve the way the narrative is being shaped. So I think that before we even come to the the brass tacks of regulation, it's important to understand that the narrative is going in one direction, which is that AI is good for asserting India's economic identity. And I'm not saying the entire narrative is incorrect or inappropriate, but it needs to be challenged at multiple levels, and which is where the approaches to regulatory governance become important. So first is the constitutional schema, which I think there was a question on, and Vidushi already covered, but let me go into that a little bit more. I think that the constitution itself should be the starting point for any form of regulation. And across countries, of course, because I'm familiar with India, I'm going to talk about the Indian constitution. There are basically two broad aspects to it. One is the protection of certain core fundamental rights that are intrinsic to human existence. So whether it is the right to free speech, which includes a number of different associated rights. One might say that the right to privacy is included within this in some respects. There's the right to equality and non-discrimination, and of course, the overall right to life and a dignified life at that. So when we think about regulation, we need to think about this aspect, but also another very important aspect of the Indian constitution, which is that it is designed to enable the state to remove or to at least mitigate structural inequality, historical structural inequality. So when we look at whether AI is being regulated in a manner that enables the state to augment these vulnerabilities or to mitigate them, we have to understand that the constitution actually lays down the first principles. And I think that's whenever we do undertake a regulation, it's not that say Niti Aayog is coming up with a regulation or Google is trying to self-regulate. The principle when they say that we believe in an AI that does no evil, or when we believe in AI that protects privacy, or when we believe in AI that does not discriminate, it's not Google or Niti Aayog setting the standard for what is discrimination. The standard for discrimination has been set through decades of constitutional jurisprudence, and that is what regulation is missing. Particularly, we're talking about the public sector, right? And the Indian constitution clearly says that whenever an action is being taken as part of a public function, that it has a direct implication for fundamental rights, even if it is not being undertaken by the government directly. The government is working with a variety of private actors, but that shouldn't change the fact that the accountability, the redress, and the extent to which AI needs to be held responsible is the constitutional standard, and it being held to those two broad facets of the constitution that I mentioned earlier. That's the first point. Second is that now we get to the regulatory brass tacks. When do you regulate AI? How do you regulate AI? First is, can you have a sort of one-size-fits-all law that regulates AI before the solutions come in without considering the work that Vidushi's been doing, without considering how it actually works on the ground? I don't think so. I think it's impossible for any regulator, given the knowledge that they have right now. And of course, you mentioned that maybe in India, the knowledge is less than what it should be in certain cases. It's very difficult to say that we are going to devise a law that regulates AI before the solutions come into play. The second possibility is that we adopt responsive regulation, which is that we see how it goes. We see the risks posed by a certain regulatory endeavor, and based on that, we take a carrot and stick approach, which is we basically escalate up a pyramid of regulatory options, starting with the most lenient to the most severe. That might work for several emerging regimes, such as say tax compliance, right, where you can judge how effectively individuals are complying. The risk is obviously there if individuals don't comply, but you can escalate up the pyramid. But with AI, and this is the argument that I make, is that it is absolutely, the risk is too severe for us to wait for a system to be rolled out, wait for particularly vulnerable communities to be impacted, for existing societal fissures already that exist getting augmented, and then deciding that we will regulate AI in a certain fashion. So we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Can't regulate before, can't regulate after. So therefore, the solution that I, in a paper with my colleagues Amber and Elonai, that we try to argue for is what is actually, I mean, the author of this regulatory strategy termed it smart regulation, perhaps. I think it was Gunningham from ANU who termed it a smart regulation. Perhaps it is self-laudatory in that sense. But I think this strategy that actually mixes a variety of tools, regulatory strategies, and regulatory phenomena to regulate AI, basing the socioeconomic context as the starting point. So you take the socioeconomic context, you derive a certain set of principles based on, I mean, constitutional ethos, and then you decide how exactly AI should be regulated in a context. So just to end with this, I think if you study, and there have been several surveys of the myriad AI ethics instruments or AI governance instruments that exist, but all of them seem to articulate 5 broad principles. And this is in line with the principles articulated by the Constitution if you read it holistically. First is the protection of human agency. Second is equality, dignity, and non-discrimination. Third is safety, security, and human impact. Fourth is accountability, oversight, and redress. And fifth is, of course, privacy and data protection. So if you take these 5 principles together, within each of these, there are certain questions that a regulator needs to ask. I don't want to go into all the questions for all of them, but just to give an example, take human agency. There are various questions a regulator should be asking before devising the appropriate regulatory strategy. But what they need, one of the questions is, what is the difference or what is the power asymmetry between the entity that is devising the solution and implementing the solution and the entity that is getting impacted by it? Now, and you've probably covered a variety of these AI solutions in your observatory, but let's take 2 different cases. One is predictive policing, the second is agriculture, right? In the first case, it is a person in the police force who is devising a solution, working with some private sector actor, and implementing it in a manner that impacts people and imposes standards of criminality on them in various parts of the country. There is clearly a huge power asymmetry between the end user of the product, which is the police person, and the parties getting impacted by it. Whereas if we look at AI in agriculture, one might argue that there the regulatory intervention needs to be different, because in several cases farmers are directly getting the information and then they are using that information to implement it. Now, obviously there are also power asymmetries, but the kind of power asymmetries that exist when there is a police person versus a person who is being accused of criminality, vis-a-vis a farmer who is using it largely to make autonomous decisions, and that's where human agency becomes a centrifugal aspect. I'm not saying that the second solution doesn't need to be regulated, but the regulatory strategy needs to be very different, and I think that needs to be at the center of any form of regulation. So it starts with the principle. You look at the socioeconomic context in which it is being unrolled, and then you need to study what's actually happening in both the sectors, and then based on that you create the appropriate regulation for that sector. That, I think, is the broad regulatory model, and of course it's not complete. It will only be complete once we have enough empirical and pilot studies, but that's basically the idea that we argued in that paper, and I think it's a useful way to take it forward.
Thanks, Indrajit. And you brought up an interesting point about how often there's something inherent in the design of these systems that they take away from ideals or the principles of human agency or human dignity, right? And I think, say that the example you gave about criminality, the idea that you have something far removed from your actual real interactions and something that's abstracting your data to make an assessment about whether you're a criminal or not, and feeding that into a very sensitive context is really important, something that absolutely should be kept in mind while regulating. And with that, I also wanted to turn finally to Padmini to kind of talk about, how you've written about and worked on ideas of design justice, right? How design, how systems can be designed to kind of improve human agency, to facilitate values of human dignity. How do you think that these ideas can kind of, be roped in or be spoken about in the context of ADMUs, particularly within the context that we're talking about in public agencies or in consequential uses in these large scale, pervasive information networks.
Yeah, so if I can, I'll actually just pick up actually from what Arindrajit was saying, both earlier on and just in his recent response, which was that what is really important is making technology legible to citizens, and this kind of quality of non-discrimination that is a value that one should aspire to. I think that value of non-discrimination immediately fails because most of these technologies are not legible to citizens. So in some work that I've done on the Personal Data Protection Bill, for example, we realized that a lot of the kind of specifications made around the bill were only could be only availed of users who were fairly sophisticated in their understanding of, say, something like consent, right? So, even though the bill kind of makes these claims that you can, find out through a consent manager, how to revoke consent to data that you may have shared, that is not an easily accessible kind of designed experience. And nowhere does any kind of document around kind of smart city or smart delivery of services. In India, at least, there's very little conversation about the design of the interfaces, about the design of those experiences that would make it legible to everybody who's using it and not only a select few. So even at just the interface, we're finding that we're failing users, and I think that is something that really kind of needs to be changed in order for these kind of experiences to be much more just in the way that they're delivered. The other way in which I feel there's a profound lacuna is that the kind of idea of embodiment itself. So embodied experience as part of this conversation, and this is something that kind of when we talk about design justice, it's fairly prominent as a principle, which is that speaking to communities about their own lived experience and their lived realities and allowing that to shape the design of technologies is actually much more likely to guarantee a higher quality of life for those people who are kind of having to use those technologies. So, one way in which we tried to kind of, almost guerrilla style, kind of explore how this could be done was, as we all know, a lot of the kind of formulation around the smart city is through maps, and Google Maps is obviously the kind of panopticon, that vision that kind of dominates a lot of our platform economy. So we did a small exercise with a group of young women that we were working with on using Wikipedia to kind of map their own experiences and map their neighborhood, just to see kind of what it means to map a neighborhood from the bottom up rather than from above. And obviously there's a deep contrast in how one experiences their neighborhood, how one experiences their interpersonal relationships with various communities when it comes to embodied experience, and none of that is factored into the delivery of these services. So I think the focus when it comes to design, as I said earlier on, I think there's this kind of championing of design thinking, which has definite limits, because when you say you empathize with the community, it actually kind of, I feel like it's quite insulting to those communities, because there is no way many of us can, kind of even begin to imagine the kind of conditions in which many people in this country have to live and survive. So I think it's just a question of kind of taking that into account, that we need to be drawing on people's own experiences and then allowing that to inform the way that we design these, and therefore ensuring legibility rather than imagining what might be legible to the user.
Thanks, Padmini. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think that it's essential that we get these ideas out to policymakers, to technology designers, to get them to start critically interrogating these things. We really shouldn't have senior bureaucrats or senior technologists who say things like you can recognize criminality by looking at a person's face, or that this recent other project, that the smart water system that's been designed for Bangalore, which tries to which looks at only, I guess, the formal water network within city infrastructure, but doesn't look at that large body of informal infrastructure, and designs only for this particular group of people. And your point's absolutely well taken. I just wanted to ask all the panelists if it's okay that we take about 5 minutes just to take a couple of questions from some of the attendees. You can give me a thumbs up if that's fine. Awesome. So if anyone has questions, you can raise your hand and I'll allow you to talk and ask your question, direct them to a particular panelist. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so maybe we'll take 2 or 3 at most. And if you don't want to do that, you can also drop it in the chat. Yeah. Maya has a question. Maya, I'm going to allow your speaker access. You can speak now.
Thank you so much, Divij, and congratulations for putting this database together. It looks amazing, and to the Design Beku team as well for making such a wonderful looking website. I'm really excited to use this more as a resource and share it with people. And that's really what my question is about, that what is the afterlife of this project and who is it open to, and how will people be able to continue to add content to it or refer to it? And yeah, so if you could talk a little bit about how this is imagined to go out in the world beyond this moment. Thanks.
Thanks. So the idea is very much for this to be the starting point for kind of a larger engagement. Particularly, I thought this would be a point for people to kind of look at what systems are in use, or also for people who've been affected by these systems or have seen these systems being used in different contexts, to try to contribute and do a sort of, like I said, like almost a counter mapping of these systems, right? To push back against the kind of hyperbolic AI claims and to look at what these systems really mean on the ground and how people are being affected by them. So that's one part, which I guess is through the interaction with the databases and the case studies here. Another part, I think, which is kind of yet to go live, but it's again about promoting participatory responses to these systems through things like, and one thing that I've noticed is, that there's an intense proliferation of these systems, like kind of they're basically everywhere. In every city, in every of the 100 smart cities that you have, there are smart solutions. Every police station or every state police force, every district police has their own system that's going on. And I think there needs to be a kind of a collective effort at extracting information out of these systems and also challenging them, which is why, so the idea is to go ahead and look at what kind of participatory tools exist. Like I said, 3 of these I think are ones that will be coming up very soon, which are about using the Right to Information Act, and also kind of going against, going like looking at questions that can specifically be asked of these questions, keeping in mind the potential and real barriers that you face within the RTI Act or within these legal barriers. So if they throw out the idea of that there's going to be a trade secret involved, how do you surpass that barrier and ask questions in a more tactical way? So that's kind of like a tactical tool to understand how to draft RTIs and get that information out. A second one is, as Vidushi said, to talk about consumer protection. There's a fairly robust consumer protection infrastructure, in terms of quasi-judicial and judicial bodies within India, and also, some very interesting law and principles which can be used again to kind of identify sources of harm and challenge them, in particularly through administrative and judicial processes. And a third is mostly for lawyers and also for people working within advocacy institutions, to try to understand how people around the world in other jurisdictions have tried to fight these systems through tactical and strategic litigation challenges, which, as I've realized, is not simply a legal effort, but really a kind of, it takes a lot of hands and a lot of kind of different voices to bring together. So I want to put together some resources for people to understand how all of these different voices can come together in drafting or kind of putting together a sustainable legal challenge, keeping in mind the legal principles, like the constitutional principles that we spoke about. So that's the idea going forward. I also hope particularly to kind of build on, to investigate some of these systems in depth a little more, through kind of an investigative journalism approach, and kind of which can maybe frame some of the eventual responses that come out of this, to just get the word out basically a lot more through various forms of media. So I was hoping that journalists can use this database to try to unpack and follow the leads that this provides, through the public documentation, through the news reports, and try to kind of investigate some of this a lot more.
Hi, can you hear me? Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm a technologist in the whole machine learning space. Was curious about this presentation, so joined. So one of the things that struck me is that see, if you look at what I observe day to day, right, all of these systems are very buggy, and it takes enormous effort to make even the simpler machine learning systems work. Now, what I don't see, even if you pass the law, even if you make it compulsory and things like that, the capacity in the engineering community and the data science community is actually very limited to understand any of these algorithms, many of which are baked into libraries. I don't. I mean, much of the conversation was around government should do this, regulator should do this, and we should have this kind of law. What I think you did not adequately focus on is whether there is capacity in the system to actually understand these machine learning systems, and assuming their intent is aligned with yours, how do you make it possible for them to deliver these? Today, there are very few data scientists who can actually explain what a machine learning model can do. So the capacity in the system is a big concern of mine. You know, of course, you can add your thoughts, but I don't see how this will work without growing the number of aware and capable people.
Thanks, Venkata. Yeah, I definitely think that that's something that needs to be done in terms of capacity building, or general efforts at educating people who are responsible for these systems. Vidushi, Arindaji, Padmini, do you have anything to add specifically to that question? How do we build? Yeah, I mean, how do we bridge this gap between clueless people using these systems or being affected by these systems, and also clueless data scientists and engineers who don't know what the consequences of them are going to be?
I'll just very quickly say that I think it's a systemic issue that we find a way to pass the buck on to different people who are involved in the supply chain, so to speak, of machine learning systems. So having some semblance of accountability, but also scrutability, audits, not just at the stage at which a system has come to exist and is being used on the ground, but also at the stage at which it is conceptualized, the assumptions that are baked into it being conceptualized. All of that's really important. And I think that's why most people who work on the policy aspects will always say design, development, deployment. So we're not just talking about a final product, we're talking about the whole life cycle of the product. I think that's an important way to reframe it, at least.
Sorry, just very quickly to beat a dead horse, perhaps, is, I think it is like this multi-stakeholder approach, or I think it's already been mentioned actually, the need for genuine consultations and capacity building. I think without that, it's very difficult. So I fully agree, and I don't really have solutions, but I think just broadly speaking, it needs to be bringing in as many communities as possible and ensure that capacity is built among as many people across the AI lifecycle.
Thanks, Indrajit. Padmini, any comments?
No, I think I'm pretty much in agreement with Vidushi and Arindaji. Yeah.
Great.
Here.
Thank you. So with that, we're a little bit over time already, so we're going to break and allow maybe 10 minutes for people to get a coffee, stretch their legs before the second panel begins, which I'm also incredibly excited about. So, some of the panelists will be staying on, hopefully. So if you have any other questions, you can, of course, post them on the chat and maybe continue those conversations offline. We really want to, keep these conversations going. And of course, if you're interested in knowing more about the observatory, please feel free to reach out to me. My details are in the website itself, and you can just drop me an email or any other form of communication. I'm always happy to talk about it. Thank you, and see you in 10 minutes.
Hello.
Hi, Brinda.
Okay, hi. Just wanted to check that
Hi.
you guys can hear me. Okay, fine, cool. So we'll just start in 3 minutes. We'll go live straight, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll go live in just about 2 minutes. Thanks everyone for joining again. Hi, Anton.
Hi.
Sorry, thought you dropped out for a bit.
Yeah, I meant to make some coffee.
Ah.
Hi, Corey. Hi, Matthias.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brinda.
Anton.
Hi, Brinda. Hi.
Hi. Lovely to see all of you.
Arindrajit, you here? Yeah, it's so nice to see everyone again.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So, hi, welcome back, everybody. I hope you were able to stretch your legs, grab a coffee or a drink, depending on what time it is. The second panel, I'm really excited about to bring together a wonderful kind of and diverse community of practitioners who have, made the effort over the last few years to go in depth into how these systems are operating in, the systems that we spoke about in the last panel, particularly in use by public authorities, how they've been operating and affecting people's lives and challenging and pushing back against these systems. The second panel, the idea here is to talk about what algorithmic accountability, the kind of conversations that we've been having at a level of principles, at a level of technical standards, at a level of also ethics, really plays out in practice. How do you start investigating these tools, as Matthias has done? How do you start advocating for more responsibility from the government, as Corey has done? Or how do you through legal action, as Vrinda and Anton have done? So I'm really excited to be convening this. Thanks everyone for joining again. Arinderjeet is going to be moderating this discussion. So over to you, Arinderjeet.
Thanks, Divij. I'm really excited about this panel. As you mentioned, a lot of the things that we were discussing at maybe slightly more abstract level, we'll actually get to hear from the experience and expertise of people who've actually been doing it and being part of the citizen-centric resistance or the citizen-centric mitigation of the algorithm. And it's really exciting to have this panel here today. Thanks a lot for joining. In the first segment, I just wanted all panelists to share broadly their experience in engaging with government ADMs, as Divij, automated decision-making processes. So let me start with Matthias and really ask you, of course, I'm sure most people here would be knowing about Algorithm Watch and the fantastic work that you have done. But broadly, I wanted you to comment on trends in algorithmic accountability, particularly with regard to government algorithms that you've observed across the globe, and maybe also share the kind of work that Algorithm Watch has been doing, because I think we've all been familiar with it, but I think it'll be great for you to touch upon that a little bit. So Matthias, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be in this round, because I also expect to see a lot more ideas and perspectives than I'm usually confronted with. So what we are trying to do is be a watchdog and an advocacy organization at the same time. Now, the watchdog function, of course, entails that we do a lot of research. We try to find out where algorithms, automated decision-making systems are being used in the real world. And we do this in a quite range of methods. What we just produced is the so-called Automating Society report. It's the second version of this. The first one came out at the beginning of 2019. And here we look at 16 European countries and where these systems are being used. And this is a mixture of, let's say, academic research and journalistic research. So we have different kinds of people in these countries. Some of them are academics, some of them are journalists, some of them are civil society members. And all of them need to have domain knowledge and also the knowledge of the context of their societies to even identify where something like automated decision-making is being used. What they cannot do in the scope of this project is, for example, do some investigative research or try to do some, experiments, re-engineering an opaque algorithm or something like this. This is completely out of the question. They can do that. They can basically monitor what is going on, and because they are all experts in this field, they know more about this than the regular person, on the street, let's say. So we do get information that is not, in that sense, publicly available. Of course, most of this is publicly available. Some of this comes out because of the research and wasn't available before, but it's a collection. But the value of that collection is to demonstrate how widely these systems are already being used, right? So I need to cut this short because it's such a huge issue. Because at the same time, what we are trying, and I think we are all also succeeding at this, at least in small instances, is that we look at concrete algorithmic systems and try to find out whether they are doing their job, whether they're doing what they're promising or whatnot. And one of the examples is that our journalistic colleague, Nicolas Kaiser-Brill, he does investigations like the one that was published under the name of Undress or Fail, where he developed a model of how to test the Instagram algorithm for the hypothesis that people who show more bare skin on Instagram get their posts promoted, whereas people who don't do that get their posts demoted or at least not promoted. And that this is a problem, you know, from several perspectives. And this is where a lot of technology comes in, because the way we do this is we call this data donation projects. People get an opportunity, a technical opportunity, a tool in that sense, a browser plugin to install it on their computers. And then this collects data that is sent back to us for us to analyze. So this is where we actually try to scrutinize the system itself. And this can be successful to a certain extent, because you can usually only find indications of what is going on. And then you confront the companies with that, and the companies then usually say, oh, you have misunderstood everything about our model, and what you're claiming is not what is actually happening in reality. But no, we are not going to offer you any kind of data to refute that. We are just going to say that what you're saying is wrong and what we are saying is right. So this is, you know, usually the outcome of this, but it helps us to produce this evidence that there are at least questionable assumptions. And this is what we do. And then what we try to do on the advocacy side, on the basis of this research, we develop policy positions, recommendations, and demands. And I'll just give you one example. It is that we are asking for a register that is publicly accessible of all automated decision-making systems that are being used by the public sector. I can probably explain why the public sector only and not the private later on. I'll skip that at the moment, and provide information about the purpose of the system that is being used, how this purpose is sort of being modeled into a decision model, and who participated in this, meaning that was this done by the public sector entity themselves, or was it outsourced to IBM or Microsoft or Amazon or whoever? And this information needs to be widely accessible, because then civil society, in the form of journalists, academic researchers, organizations like us, and maybe even oversight institutions, have a better chance of looking into what is actually going on. And I leave it here, you know, because otherwise I'll be talking for 10 minutes.
Thanks, Matthias. I think that covered everything really succinctly. So now let me go to Divij, and we've heard in the previous panel from Divij about the AI Observatory project that he's starting, and he's of course going to we're all going to build on. But I think the question that I wanted to ask you, Divij, is in terms of the future of algorithmic accountability in India, what are the broad trends that you see? Can we conceptualize a possible watchdog? What would that watchdog look like? What action should the government be taking to actually, not just in terms of the trends that have gone on so far, but also the future trends? What do you see? How do you see this landscape evolving, particularly because you've been engaging through your AI Observatory with the politics of this space, and also with the law and the law and policy developments?
Thanks, Indrajit. So what I've seen has been incredibly concerning, I think, you know, and I spoke about this in the last panel, but what I've seen is the increasing delegation of important and consequential public decisions to private actors or to private systems, whose logic is completely obscured, which doesn't follow, you know, principles of democratic accountability or even constitutional principles, which are meant to kind of you know, go against harms that may come to particular communities or individuals. So I'm not super optimistic about what the future of this can look like. What does make me a little optimistic is, I guess, the efforts of people like Brinda, you know, people like Vidushi or people like IFF, who are kind of trying to engage people in understanding and pushing back against these systems. So, and by people, I mean both people who are affected by these. You know, one good entry point into this, I guess, is to build these conversations around communities that are that can kind of participate in these conversations more realistically in terms of people who have access to the internet, people who are kind of more savvy about these technical concepts. I guess the bigger challenge is roping in people who are affected by these decisions, but who don't have the ability to really know about how data is being collected about them, is being used within automated decision-making systems. Once they face the brunt of or the consequence of the decision, right? So if you look at the numbers that emerge out of this research, a few million people in Odisha just one day stripped of their welfare benefits because IBM discovered that there was a fraud, right? None of them were like made aware of how this happened. If you look at the NERPAP algorithm, the electoral roll purification, 1.5 million voters in Telangana denied one day of the right to vote. And these are really ridiculous. And the question then is, about what do these systems mean, and how do we design for responsible regulation or accountability for users who aren't at, who don't maybe see discriminatory ads on Facebook, or people who aren't able to interact with these systems and experience them, or build up an experience through their interaction with information systems. And I guess the idea needs to be of emerging standards and structures of systemic accountability from within the government, as well as kind of bringing together coalitions of journalists, activists, and lawyers to take these causes to the right places, to take them to court, to take them to policy rooms, and to take them to lawmakers. So that's kind of, that's where I see this going. I'm not sure what kind of regulatory structure would eventually emerge, but you've seen how constant advocacy against Aadhaar did to some extent lead both to the Supreme Court's acceptance of its failures, as well as to the legislature's acceptance of the need to have a statutory regulation for something like this, whatever its other failings might be. And I guess we need to keep having these conversations and building on those kinds of successes.
Thanks, Divij. And I think a lot of what you said is actually a great segue to my question for Vrinda, who is of course a hugely respected researcher and a hugely respected practicing lawyer. And I think so. I mean, her writing is something that everyone should definitely check out. But she's also, and what I would like to ask her today is about her involvement with a number of advocacy efforts, which Divij, some of which you referred to, Aadhaar. More recently, the entire political and advocacy ecosystem around Arogya Setu. So, Vrinda, what I wanted to ask you was, in terms of both your experience with these efforts, what were the hurdles that were faced in the political ecosystem, but also what do you feel enabled you to sort of go forward, and what are, just learnings that you had from the process? I think that'll be really useful for the audience here to share. So, Vrinda.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I should really preface by saying I'm easily the most underqualified on this panel. So I think there's a lot more for me to learn from people. But I think given kind of my experience, looking at strategic litigation in India, whether it was Aadhaar, the contact tracing app, Arogya Setu, or even thinking through, potential challenges about the use of facial recognition technology in India. And I think there are different levels of hurdles, right? So first is always information collection. We do have a system where the government is not necessarily proactive with providing a lot of information. So you have to get information either through parliamentary questions or right to information requests. And unfortunately, some of these right to information requests are often blocked, citing, security reasons or, exemptions, claiming that we don't actually need to provide you this information. So I think that is at the first level where we often face some hurdles, is collection of information. And which is why what Divij was saying about working together as a community, so working with practitioners, working with civil society, working with even people who are affected, is very important to bring all of that information to the court. So apart from information collection, it's also explaining that information to the court. I think we really saw this in both Aadhaar and Arogya Setu. So you have one version that's the predominant version that the government says, which is, oh, contact tracing apps are amazing, they work really well, we should have 100% uptake, they should be made mandatory. And so the litigation that we had done for Arogya Setu was saying that you cannot have 100% mandatory contact tracing apps. This especially in a country like India, where we don't even have a data protection legislation, nor do we have any legislative basis for these programs. So you have a government kind of version. And so to explain and counter that in court, to explain the idea of false positives and false negatives and bias in algorithms. Remember, in India, the conversation around AI is still very much at a policy level amongst experts. It is broadening, but it's not broadening fast enough. I think in the public space, you really do see much more about the benefits of algorithms and big data rather than some of the issues with respect to bias and even how effective these things are, the idea of false positives and negatives. So I think that is something that also has to build up. And I think the institutional constraint that we really faced, especially in Aadhaar, where we actually had a full-blown litigation, was the fact of information asymmetry in terms of being able to present that. So the burden of proof. So as a petitioner who's challenging any of these systems, it is the proportionality requires us to prove, is this the least restrictive alternative? Was there any alternative that was better that could have been used by the government? Some of this is information that may not necessarily be, in the petitioner's domain, which is why I think it's important to have a lot of evidence that you give in terms of expert evidence. So one of the things we have started doing, this was done in Aadhaar, this was done in Arogya Setu also, is we get expert evidence. So we actually get affidavits of experts, which is not something you've seen that often in Indian courts, but you start getting affidavits of experts to explain what are some of the problems, right? So what are the surveillance concerns when it comes with a digital identity, to explain that, what are some of the exclusion concerns and how is it affecting people? When the digital identity is not working, how is it affecting people on the street? You also have in the case of contact tracing, we had an expert affidavit that was speaking about what are the issue of false positives and false negatives with the contact tracing app that the government is employing. So you have, you're trying to get around that by having expert affidavits. Finally, though, because this is all happening at a constitutional court, so at a high court or a Supreme Court, there is actually no cross-examination. There is no, there is the evidence of two parties is not speaking to each other. The government says this is great, we say this is not, and the court is not really, those two parties are not speaking to each other. So in Aadhaar, for instance, we kept on saying, look, the government is making all these claims. They had a PowerPoint presentation which said that Aadhaar is great and all the security concerns are met and there are no concerns. And we said, let us, allow us to cross-examine the people involved so that we can counter these claims. You cannot just use those claims as basis. The court did not allow us to cross-examine them. So you had a government spokesperson who came and explained the benefits of Aadhaar, whereas we as the petitioners were not allowed to have any expert who came and explained the issue in a simple manner to the government, right? To the court, sorry. So you also just have this inequality of arms, where the state, which already has more power, is actually getting more power because they can get an authority, they can get the machine and say, see, this is how the machine works, it's so easy, it's so perfect. And you then are not allowed to get your expert to come and explain it in a simple manner, to have a PowerPoint presentation that will explain some of the problems. So I think these are the different areas of concerns. I think there is some change, judges are becoming more aware of these issues, but it is a long, I think it's a long haul fight. And I think, as Divij pointed out, just having conversations, just having litigation does help bring the issue into the public domain, does then have people speaking for and against an issue, explaining the reason why they agree or disagree with the court. And the one advantage in India is court proceedings in India. This is what a friend of mine who had come from New Zealand, who lived in India for like a couple of months, he's like, your newspapers really cover what is happening in the Supreme Court in the front pages. Apparently it doesn't happen everywhere else, right? But in India, court proceedings get recorded in the front pages. What happens in court is discussed on primetime television and in newspaper editorial articles. So I think that is also one of the advantages of any litigation. So sorry for this long answer.
I think that was great, Brinda. I think the last point you made as well about litigation, of course, one is that if it's successful, that's brilliant. But even otherwise, I think the point that you made was very powerful about that, particularly in India, bringing the discourse into the public domain and getting more people actively interested and participating in the discussion is I think, a very important point to note. So now let me go over to Anton, who's, of course, for those of you who do not know, he was involved in the litigation against Siri, which was a Dutch, I believe, a fraud welfare risk scoring system. And he was involved in litigation, won the final litigation, and that was, of course, it was covered in several news outlets as well. And he's been involved in several litigations since. So I want to sort of pose the same question to you, Anton, in terms of, I mean, what factors do you think made it right for you to actually challenge that specific algorithmic decision-making system? And I mean, and recently you were speaking about how you continue to be involved in holding technology companies using algorithms to account. So what were the factors that prompted you to actually take on that litigation, and what were sort of your experiences and expertise that you can share on the litigation itself that might be useful for this audience? So over to you, Anton.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. And I've been listening into the previous panel, and I think all the remarks and all the concerns are very, similar to what we are struggling with here in the Netherlands. So just to briefly introduce myself, I'm an independent lawyer from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and I have been involved in assisting a number of privacy organizations from the Netherlands in bringing a case against this system, a systeemrisico-indicatie in Dutch, a risk assessment system. And this was used by the Dutch government to detect various forms of fraud, and including social benefits and allowances and tax fraud. And to do so, of course, there was a collection of data from all kinds of government databases. So first, we tried to gain access to information about the system by filing a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request. But this didn't produce any useful answers. The ministry just simply refused to answer our questions, basic, simple questions like how many citizens are involved, how many cases of fraud have you found, how much money have you been able to get back? No answers. Partially because they didn't want to give it, but also I think the Dutch government just didn't have oversight, which is very concerning by itself because these projects are all decentralized, right? So then we decided to go to court, to the Court of Amsterdam, and in February of this year, the court decided that the Siri Act, which allows for the use of Siri, is a violation of the European Convention of Human Rights. Mostly, the most important arguments, of course, the system is insufficiently transparent, it's not verifiable, and it contributes to stereotyping and bias towards specific groups in society, such as people with a lower socioeconomic status or immigration background. So after the judgment, we were very happy, of course, and also to learn that the Dutch government did not appeal the case. We didn't expect that. They didn't appeal it even. We found out 2 weeks later that why, because they introduced a new legislation, which is we call it Super Siri. It's much worse even than what we had before. So this was just phase one of our struggle. We have to keep fighting. So maybe I think it was very important. There were no individual people affected. We didn't find anybody just because they weren't aware, most probably. So what we did instead, we used public figures that were involved in the case as applicants. We know beforehand that they would not be found admissible, most probably. But anyway, we included them and they would go on television and talk about the case. So a few important parts of the judgment. First of all, the court says, well, the state has a special responsibility when applying an instrument like Siri. It also said that risk reports by itself do have a significant effect in the means of the GDPR. So there's a number of criteria to say whether or not you are dealing with automated decision-making in the sense of the GDPR. And one of those is there a significant effect? And the court says, yes, a risk alert is in fact considered to be having a significant effect. Like you said, since then I also started a number of other cases about automated decision-making against Uber and Ola cabs. So on behalf of the European drivers, together with, or on behalf actually of the App Drivers and Couriers Union from the UK, who's doing very important work to represent all those drivers from all these different countries. And last Wednesday we had A court hearing, very interesting. It was a hybrid hearing because of the corona crisis, which was actually good in this case because many people were calling in from all parts of the world, including India. And I think the court was like a bit surprised, but also this emphasized how important this issue is for many people around the world. And if we can use GDPR to get transparency here, it will also be good for people from outside the EU, right? So a bit like Vrinda just said, Ola and Uber are both also arguing there are all kinds of exceptions. So they're saying, well, we have to protect the privacy of the passenger. I told the court, listen, most of these data and the algorithms that we want to have transparency about, they have to do with the service agreement between the driver and the passengers, right? Uber and Ola explicitly states they are no party to that agreement. They are just matching. So why, if I go to a restaurant or if I go to a hotel and they ask me to give a rating, and I give the rating and they put it in their system, is it an infringement of my freedoms? Of course not. It's just a normal part of the service of the driver. I didn't hear any response from Ola and Uber on this point. So I think might be a strong argument. We'll see what the court says about this. But so we asked for a lot of data. We asked for matching data. How are tariffs being calculated and route information, GPS data, driver profiles, because although Ola and Uber are denying that, we have presented evidence that they in fact have profiles about drivers which can have very significant effects for those people. And also the fraud probability scores that they're using, facial recognition. I saw the court struggling. They told me this is uncharted territory. We'll need some time. Well, no, it's not going to be 6 weeks. Like we will need more time. Anyway, so it's going to be exciting to see how this will turn out, and I'll keep you posted.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I think already some themes emerging, right, through the comments that I've heard in terms of governments when rolling out the solution often don't have a lot of the answers, and I mean also due to the fact that often the level of oversight that needs to be exercised is simply not enough, and that's something that all of you have been picking up on, and that's really I think important to think about algorithmic accountability going forward. So now to Corey, who's of course has extensive years and experience in public rights advocacy. Of course, with algorithms, but even before that, she's presently the director of Foxglove Legal, which has had huge success this past year, again, in terms of through various advocacy measures, ensuring that the algorithmic decision-making systems in the UK are basically brought to account. Some of them have been covered widely by the media, including in here. So, for example, I was following closely the A-level, the use of algorithms to basically as a substitute for examination. So, again, Corey, I wanted you to shed some light on your experiences, the expertise that you had in terms of bringing algorithms to account, and any sort of suggestions that you can share for all of us here. Thanks. Over to you.
Thanks, it's great to be here. And the first thing I want to say, which is not the question that you asked, is that what's so exciting about panels like this is the opportunity to compare notes and learn from people kind of doing the work in different parts of the world. Because as Anton said, these problems are absolutely everywhere. And actually, I've been incredibly inspired by the lawyers and activists in India who've really been at some of the forefront of pushing back against some of these technologies, Aadhaar and others. I've really been inspired by it. I once had the privilege to kind of listen in on a call where like people who litigated against Aadhaar, people who litigated against a similar system in Jamaica were advising the team litigating against Faduma Namba. And I think we need to do the same work with some of the incredibly exciting stuff that Anton is doing for gig workers, which I think is maybe transferable to other platform workers like content moderators that we work with, or also in India. I mean, I really do sincerely think that's, it's one of the most interesting uses of the GDPR going, really, that case. And I think we're going to talk in the next wave about kind of democratic accountability, aren't we? But some of what Matthias said about kind of AI registers kind of jives with what we're thinking about that. But anyway, you asked about the cases. I will just do a really top line summary of 3 of them. I think the kind of lesson I would draw out from all of them is, well, there are a couple. I mean, one is that I would say that these systems, some kind of algorithmic decision system or things where the state starts to fuse with a private company in one or another way, all of them have been what we would call permissionless. In other words, nobody has gone to the public and asked, explain what they're doing, explain what they have sought to prioritize, and ask whether in fact a system is democratically acceptable to people or not. And that's, which is why we need something like the register that Matthias was talking about. And so I'll talk about the cases, but the other theme I would say emerges from them is that GDPR is a piece of it in each of these challenges. It's a string to the bow, but it's definitely not the only fruit, and that there's a lot of value for public or constitutional lawyers or whatever you want to call us in seeking to apply the wider, really basic range of public law principles to try to bring these systems within the rule of law and greater democratic control. GDPR, I don't think, was the most important part of any of the cases that we won. And then the third thing that's common to all of them, I would say, is that we won them all before the judge said that we won, right? The government caved in each of these legal challenges, which I think speaks not to the kind of amazing argumentation that we put forward, but actually to the fact that these systems have gone almost totally unchallenged for a long time, and that there was very little reflection within government before the systems were built or bought or rolled out. So the 3 cases that we had, one is actually a transparency case. So during the kind of first peak of the coronavirus crisis, the NHS and the health service decided to whip through what was called a data store, so a massive amalgamation of various kinds of NHS's health data. And the NHS has very, very valuable troves of health data, by the way. It has some of the largest longitudinal health data sets in the world, and put them together on what they were calling a giant health database, a COVID-19 data store. They said that the system was emergency, so they didn't have to go through the usual procurement or transparency processes. They said that it was anonymized, and they said that it was going to be unwound at the end of the pandemic. The reason that they said all of those things and sought to reassure the public that way is that they were working with some quite controversial big tech corporate partners. So not simply the Amazons and the Microsofts of the world, but Faculty AI, a kind of shady firm here in the UK, and a security-linked firm called Palantir, who essentially cut its teeth working with the CIA and special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, then moved to offer various kinds of policing services. And I think as the UK people come to know more about the company, are going to have real democratic concerns about whether it is a fit and proper partner for the National Health Service. But anyway, so we an Open Democracy, a news website, basically said, look, you've got to, it's all very well to say that this is an emergency, but that's this is the thin end of the wedge for what may become a permanent system and may be creeping data privatization of the NHS and may be used to affect kind of decision-making. We don't know about people's, we don't know, compliance with lockdown or whatever. We don't know because so little was said about the system. So at least publish the contracts and explain more about how it works. Under the common, it wasn't just an FOI case. It was saying we had the right to the information under the common law. And just as we were about to file the papers, they caved and they disclosed the contracts. And we learned something from that disclosure that I think is quite important when we think in the future about the relationship between public authorities and private corporations, which is that the first iteration of the contract, they amended this after our transparency lawsuit was in prospect. But the first version of the contract retained the kind of intellectual property rights, anything that the companies learned from their privileged access to the data, that sat with the company, right? So if they were able to use the access to refine or improve their product, that IP sat with the company. Now, as I say, after we put in the transparency lawsuit, they voluntarily handed it back to the NHS. They claimed they amended the contract. So that there was no project-specific intellectual property rights going to the corporations. But I think those are going to be really important concerns. And I think the other lesson I would say from that case for advocates is there was a groundswell of concern in the UK. It was partly about privacy, but I don't think actually in the main that was the thing that was most successful. I think the main concern that people had was about creeping privatization and about what the relationship was going to be had between corporations and the NHS, and were we getting public value for this incredible an important public asset. Second case, I'll go really quickly, what involved an algorithm that the Home Office had used to process every visa application to the United Kingdom since 2015. So it determined, without people really knowing about it, the rights of millions and millions of people to come to the UK to study, to work. It determined who got to go to the wedding or who didn't, who got to go to the birth or who didn't, who missed the funeral and who didn't. And it just turned out that the way that they had designed it was explicitly discriminatory. They had a list, which they wouldn't disclose the names to us, but they had a list of, let's say, undesirable nations who were automatically likely to be streamed as high risk. It was a traffic light risk score that said how likely you were to kind of default on your visa, likely to be streamed red, and therefore much more likely to be denied a visa. Again, going back to this question about GDPR, there was a GDPR line of argument, but actually the main argument that we used in the case for why this was unlawful was that it violated the Equalities Act, that you just couldn't engage in that kind of explicit discrimination. And there was also, and these are hard to win in public law in the UK, but actually the way they had designed it was so crazy that we actually had a very serious argument that the system was irrational, because we asked them how countries got on the list of dodgy nations, and they replied and said, well, negative events. And we said, well, what's a negative event? And they said, oh, well, you know, things like being denied a visa. So pause there for a minute and think. So if you were streamed red because your country's on the list, denied a visa, that information was then a data point that went back into the system to justify keeping your nation on the list of dodgy nations, lather, rinse, repeat. And so there was a kind of algorithmic doom loop set up by the way that the system was designed. And I have to say, you have to just, all you have to do is say it in English to see that that is just not just a racist system, but an irrational system. And the fact that they hadn't seen it until we tested it and we sued with the Joint Council of the Welfare of Immigrants shows, I think, just how little reflection there has been around the design and rollout of these systems. Okay, the third one, which you mentioned, and then I'll let somebody else talk, the A levels. So that, I think, really shows you just how permissionless these systems are, right? If you would just ask the students of the UK, hey, listen, look, with COVID, there's going to be some grade inflation, and to avoid this one-time spike, we're just going to roll out this algorithm that's going to knock, you know, it'll do fine in the aggregate. It will maintain the curve, but it's going to systematically privilege people in small subjects and small schools. So that's rich people in rich schools, and it's going to systematically downgrade, say, the bright student in a large subject in the historically underperforming school. Point, in my view, was a very old school public law point that we call in the UK ultra vires. So we just said that Ofqual had that's the government department who like designed the testing algorithm, had exceeded its statutory powers, its legal powers, by designing a system that didn't actually measure students on the basis of their individual performance, because that's what the statute empowers them to do, right? You got to grade the kid, not the school. And we say by just substituting in the school's historic performance to set the grade, they had exceeded their statutory powers. Again, they caved. You know, I wish I could say it was only our case, but when you have everybody from like the posh school Eton on down writing angry letters to Boris Johnson, I don't think I can claim sole credit for it. But I think that we did have the kind of strongest and most credible set of legal arguments, and they would have been in hot water if they had chosen to defend the claim. So I think that I can just let people talk, but I think there are a lot of different opportunities there to apply kind of old traditional standards of public law to these systems as well. But I hope we can talk about more widely about, you know, how to make them more democratically accountable to people in the first place as well.
Yes, and we certainly can. So let me stick with you, Corey, for the second sort of segment, which is more of the sort of political. And you mentioned this, that the government caved in several cases. And of course, when we look at the political ecosystem, of course, there is the government themselves who possibly didn't put in enough thought before devising the systems. There is the private partner, whether it's Palantir or whatever it is, who plays a role in the political ecosystem. But the most powerful part of it, of course, is broadly speaking, the resistance, right? And of course, as I mentioned, I was following here from India, the A-level, the backlash against that. There was some form of protests as well that went on. So could you tell us more about the political ecosystem and how that worked? You mentioned, of course, that there were various actors in play, and getting someone like Boris Johnson to say that or his government to say that they were wrong is, of course, a great achievement. So how exactly did these political factors work together to actually ensure democratic accountability?
I think what was unusual about A levels, and we're not going to see this replicated for a lot of these systems, is that they made the mistake of downgrading people with significantly more social capital and economic clout than is usually the case in these systems, right? Like, look, suddenly you got parents, right? You got middle class parents whose kids lost their university place. Out there. So in a way that I wish I could say that we organized it, but actually in many ways the outrage was organic, right? It was suddenly hundreds of thousands of kids' lives were thrown into chaos by the decision that was made. And I think our challenge as advocates and activists is actually to try to convert the fact that now, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have, the scales have kind of fallen to their eyes and they see that the power is being exercised in this partly automated way. They say, listen, it's not just about grades. Actually, this happens everywhere. And it happens for people who have much less political power than, let's say, middle-class parents and people in schools, right? It happens to people at the front end of predictive policing systems. It happens for people in benefit systems. Of organizing a kind of wider set of political debate. But I think that took a lot more kind of, if I can use a horrible Instagram word, like influencer action, and not, and it wasn't the one, you wouldn't have probably otherwise organically have had just thousands of people going into the street in the same way that you did with the students.
Yes, to respond to that, one of the effects of our case has been that some members of parliament have come forward and have actually apologized for not striking down the Syria Act in the parliament. They said, well, we weren't paying attention, we were wrong. And I think that's a very important step forward, because they're acknowledging it was their duty to prevent this. And now with the new act, the new Super Syria Act, we will have to see if the parliament will take more responsibility. Yeah.
Can I just add one question or comment? Sorry, I'm going to do have like an order of running here, but just the last thing I want to just to pick up that point that Matthias made earlier about these AI registers, right? You can't, like, we shouldn't have to be a data scientist or a computer scientist to unpack these systems, right? We're founded on the basic principle that actually the system has to be democratically accountable to everyone. And the onus should be on the public authority to say what they wish to build or to buy, explain how it works, explain why they need it, and ask the public whether it is democratically acceptable. You know, there's a lot of talk about kind of auditing bias in these systems and so forth and so on. And I would really like to see the democratic debate around the systems not just engage the how they work, but actually which areas of public life it's appropriate to have them in at all and which it isn't. So we're going to be kind of launching a project early next year, trying to work with local authorities to try to copy some of the kind of interesting models that we've started to see out of Amsterdam and Helsinki, try to build these registers on the idea that, you know, you've got to at least know first what you're aiming at before you can have the debate about whether this system should exist. But I really do think that we should empower citizens to kind of ask, well, not just the how, but actually the whether. Like, is this something that we actually want in one or another area of public life?
Can I add something? I think in the Uber case, we see the role of unions is very important, because all those drivers by themselves, they cannot stand up to Uber. They're just, I think they're just afraid to go to court and start suing Uber, right? So they need a union to do it. And in court last Wednesday, both Ola and Uber were saying, well, they cannot be assisted by their union. That's an abuse of rights. Doesn't make sense to me. So I think, and it's starting here also. So the Dutch worker union FNV now also is interested in joining the effort to represent people from the gig economy. And I think they have overlooked that group for a very long time.
Thank you, Anton. I think that also speaks to something that Vrinda was saying earlier, that, I mean, just having litigation itself and putting it into the public eye, I'm guessing that has also by itself raised awareness in that regard, right? So you have workers who maybe weren't as aware of their rights now being more aware, right? I think that's something that just across panelists, that's a theme that's emerging as well.
The Siri coalition actually said at the first meeting, we don't expect to win this case. We think we're going to lose it. This is not the point. We want to make sure people will read about it in the paper, people will start debate. I was called in the last 4 weeks by more than 40 drivers from the Netherlands who suddenly were reading about their own situation, suddenly understand, well, this is actually an issue. I'm not the only one who's been deactivated like this. And then they get angry, they start calling me, now I have a problem because, but well, we'll find a solution for that.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, but I mean, I suppose positive tidings going forward. So now coming back to Vrinda. So we've heard about the political ecosystem in the UK, in the EU, and how some of these challenges worked out. So you of course spoke about in great detail in your first intervention about how it worked out in the court, how it was inequitable and in many ways entrenched certain already existing inequalities. But I wanted you to sort of weigh in on the overall broader civil society ecosystem and how that played out. And in fact, there's a great question which was asked in response to your previous intervention that sort of speaks to this question, is that how much of policy research takes into account bringing the law and civic society to a generalized state of commonality about technology and AI that can broader civic participation? So this is a question from Vishal Kumaraswamy, and I think the broad question that I'm trying to ask you is, what is the political ecosystem that you faced when you undertook the advocacy efforts that you spoke about, and what were the challenges there, not just at the court level, but also broader challenges and opportunities? And the second question about how we can, the policy research ecosystem, how that fits into more broadly technology and AI. So I know that's a bit of a convoluted question, but I tried to merge my question with the question that Vishal asked there. So over to you, Linda.
Sorry. I'll try answering both because I also know we're short of time. But actually, this goes to both, I think, what Corey and Anton said. One, in terms of, who are the people who are affected? Are they the privileged class? Are they the kind of lower class? And I think we saw this in Aadhaar. Aadhaar debate was basically on two prongs. One, is it used for, can Aadhaar be made mandatory for welfare payments, right? And to some large extent, most people didn't really care about Aadhaar when the debate was just about welfare payments, because, whatever, of course, people who take ration from the government, there may be some cheating that's happening there, and it's fine, we need a card. And so the debate was very much like really limited to privacy activists who said, you are not understanding what the concerns are. When Aadhaar started being made mandatory for mobile linking and bank linking, or for the payment of taxes, and when it started affecting middle class people, right, when they had to call up and they received 20 calls from telecom service providers saying, link your Aadhaar, suddenly they were like, oh my God, like, what is this that's being made mandatory, right? So I think that is when you really saw the development of Aadhaar as a national debate really happen, when it started affecting the middle class. And I think that is unfortunately very sad, that I think to issues that were related to exclusion and welfare, it was sort of, in one place. I think, and then going to what Anton said, which is, a victory is just a first starting point, and then the government acts again and again. And I think you're seeing this in Aadhaar again, right? So the Supreme Court laid down various guidelines. Those guidelines haven't necessarily been followed. There are now states that are saying, oh, we may need Aadhaar linkage for your vaccine distribution. There is absolutely no reason why a COVID-19 vaccine needs to be linked to Aadhaar. Absolutely no reason, right? You also have a government that is saying that Aadhaar is the one card that is going to solve all the identity problems. But then the same government is releasing a new digital health ID card, right? So now this is a card that's going to digitize all your health information. So just why do we need so many of these, right? Like, either you're saying that Aadhaar is not the answer to all the problems, which was then completely contrary to your initial claim. So I think that's kind of one problem. I think in India, a specific problem is the government, and maybe this is happening in other countries, the government is also just doing so many things at the same time that it's hard to focus your attention on what is the policy issue that I want to take up, or what is the policy issue that deserves national attention, right? So I think facial recognition technology, Vidushi said this in another panel when we were together, which is that in the US, you're actually seeing, this summer with Black Lives Matter, etc., a lot of the companies themselves saying, actually, we will not sell facial recognition technology to government law enforcement agencies. At the same time, in India, that is simultaneously, you are seeing an uptake in the use of FRT by law enforcement, right? It's being used now for election polling. It's slowly being used by, law enforcement agencies. It's being used in protests. And again, it just hasn't had that similar kind of pushback. Because, oh, these protesters, there may be someone who's violent in there. Like, oh, it's being used more against, like in Telangana, for instance, it's used more against Muslims. So you just don't have that similar pushback. And what is interesting to me is that, and I guess this goes back a bit to the A-level example, the Central Board of Secondary Education, which is, which conducts the A-levels in India, has said that, oh, you will have facial, they say it's not facial recognition technology, it's face matching technology. Kind of not sure what the difference is. Face matching technology will be now necessary. Why is facial recognition technology necessary for marks, like for the writing of exams? So I think that is, it's going to be interesting to see if that issue is now going to get spoken about. And I think coming to the second question, which is how do you ensure these debates come out in the public? I think, like I said, the fact that so many different things are happening, we still have a government, that was pushing, for instance, citizenship amendment, amendments that are going through. So this year itself, you see there are protests that are happening with respect to farm laws, right? That are happening all the time right now in the national capital for the last 1 month. You have protests that are happening to India's like love jihad laws that are being passed by various states. You then have, these technology things that are happening with respect to COVID vaccine, with respect to contact tracing, with respect to facial recognition technology. And I think somewhere all of this is getting bunched up. So the outrage is also just this one general outrage. And I think the nuances of each of these issues has to kind of be brought out. And I think part of what policy has to do is really open these conversations wide, have those debates in the national media, in the papers, in parliament, like make parliamentarians feel like there is responsibility for these actions that you take up, right? And I think also, I think if you get parents involved, right, like it's great because no one is more angry than parents who believe that their children have been cheated. So I think if you can get kind of everyone involved and not make it seem like something that either only affects the marginalized communities or the religious minorities, but actually affects all of us. And it can affect us tomorrow. If the police is using facial recognition technology for law enforcement, it can be me tomorrow who is just, called up wrongly. So I think what you need is really just a broad-based coalition that can keep these issues in the public domain. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for answering my rather sort of convoluted question very effectively. So now, again, the politics.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I think I lost audio for that.
Oh, sorry. Maybe my, am I audible, Divij? Okay, sorry, my connection possibly is a little unstable. What I wanted to ask you was, you already covered this a little bit when you spoke about your AI Observatory and the section you have on the politics of the AI ecosystem in India. But I was wondering if you could quickly summarize, in terms of algorithmic accountability, how do the politics of the AI ecosystem in India actually shape the algorithmic accountability angle? So of course, it's not just the courts or the government. Right? There are various other actors in play, and Vrinda's already spoken about a number of them, and Anton and Corey earlier spoke about them in EU and in the UK context. So, what's the broad ecosystem like in India?
Thanks, and I think that's a really relevant question, because absolutely the way these systems are being developed, designed, and implemented is enmeshed within very much broader political and economic changes that we see occurring. These trends of kind of privatization, these trends of prioritizing particular claims of efficiency, particular claims of what I would call like technocracy, over the claims of people who are affected by systems, who are affected by policies and laws and developments. And so to give you an example, I'll give two examples, right? So first, let's see the way in which the right to information movement developed. Almost a revolutionary movement in a country where public administration was often incredibly inaccessible to people. The RTI Act and the People's Movement for the Right to Information kind of really struck towards really moved towards a more radically open government, at least in the law and on the books. And now we're seeing all of that regress right? Through trends that are both linked to the kinds of systems that we've been discussing because of kind of, the trade secrets that algorithms are and the private involvement in them, as well as these concerns that keep being thrown up of national security or privacy of bureaucrats and so on and so forth. We're gradually seeing this regress, and that's a prioritization of a particular claim, right? It's a prioritizing the claims of the private developers who hold business interests in these. It prioritizes the claims of the mathematical models and the kinds of things that are being developed here, at the risk of greater opacity, at the risk of, at the risk of obscuring democratic accountability of these systems. So that's one way in which, this is one example of how the larger political economy is playing out within these systems as well. Another example is, say, from Aadhaar, right? Similarly, now in Aadhaar, the government, if you follow the case, that there were two kinds of evidence that were presented to the court. There was empirical evidence that had been collected by through kind of ethnographic work and quantitative work to show that there were instances of discrimination, that there were instances of exclusion linked to particular demographic identities, so kind of very obvious direct discrimination, which should have been unconstitutional, right? At the same time, you had the UIDAI present these very technocratic claims of, this is how our model works, this is the efficiency rate, the accuracy rate, and it's supposed to be 98% accurate, without releasing the metrics of those accuracy, without telling people how this accuracy is to be measured. And in fact, what it really means to be, even if you're 98% accurate, what does it mean for the 2% that's left out, right? And if you then read the judgment, you see that the court also decided to prioritize those claims of technocratic efficiency, those claims of accuracy that were thrown up by the UIDA at the expense of the lived experience that were documented by the petitioners, right? The experiences of the people who were denied ration, who were denied welfare because their fingerprints did not match. And this is kind of, again, it's this larger claim of prioritizing efficiency in the market, prioritizing cost savings and welfare over the very legitimate and human, experiences and claims that people have, which may not be mathematically accurate, which may not kind of reflect perfectly within the particular data model that's been created, which is assumed to work in perfect scenarios. And this kind of repeats over and over again. It repeats in, demographic bias and facial recognition systems. It repeats in these fraud welfare claims that you have. Again, an example of how this is playing out in Telangana, right? The Samagra Vedika system. It matches your electricity bill to your ration card or your pension and housing schemes to determine whether or not you should be eligible for a pension scheme. Now, what the system assumes is that if you have a large electricity bill, that means that you likely have a larger income and therefore shouldn't be eligible for such and such scheme. And now this conception of the problem is missing out so much contextual and relevant information, like how many people are within that particular household that you're measuring. Is there a business that's being run out of that household that relies on heavy electricity use? And so much other kind of like so much other like human context that's just missing when we start abstracting these into levels of data and efficiency and data models. So yeah, I absolutely think that it's really relevant and really critical to keep in mind these larger political and economic trends. There's been some fascinating studies of how this has been occurring in various parts of the world, how kind of like, I guess, neoliberal governmentality is being prioritized in the way in which these technologies are emerging and also being embedded. I think a particular area of study should be this link between like neoliberal technologies and prioritizing the claims of these large technology companies, and the link between governance and public administration. And really, I guess, this latest bout of research, the AI Observatory, is also an effort towards making those linkages through revealing the data and revealing the kind of discourses that are surrounding it.
Can I respond? Can I respond to Divij? Short?
Yeah, please, yeah.
What puzzles me is, if I look at the Uber case, this seems to be a private sector issue, right? From a commercial company. But if you look closer, actually, Uber is using algorithms for one of the reasons is that they want to comply with very strict requirements by, for example, Transport for London, which is a government agency. So they're telling Uber, you should take measures to protect passengers. And if you don't, we'll take your license away. So Uber, from a commercial point of view, of course they want to protect their license. They're going to use algorithms in a very strict way. They will always give the benefit of the doubt to a passenger who complains. And the individual drivers are just, being disregarded because they're sort of puppets who are replaceable, right? But what I want to emphasize here, it's like an interaction between public and commercial parties, actually. So you must fight both. You must go to Uber, but you must also explain to Transport for London, for example, that this is happening, They might not even be aware. What makes it even worse, first, Uber must make sure there is no fraud on the platform. They use very broad definition of fraud. If they deactivate a driver, they report it to Transport for London, and Transport for London revokes the license of the driver. So he cannot work for Uber, but he cannot work at all anymore as a taxi driver. So this is, again, private and public entities interacting in a way that makes everything worse.
Yeah. Private, and public. Thanks, Anton. So I think Matthias is would be great to sort of wrap this segment up. And I mean, I suppose I have two questions for you, two related questions. One is, again, what are the broad trends that you're seeing, Matthias, in terms of political accountability in the political ecosystem around the world? And again, from the perspective of Algorithms Watch, because of the fantastic work that you all do, how does Algorithm Watch fit into and sort of use the political ecosystem to do the excellent work that you all are doing? So I think you're over to you, Matthias.
The EU is complicated enough, Around the world is probably pretty too much of a question to answer for me. But yeah, I think what is happening in the European Union is that there is a ton of proposed regulation. So you have a hard time following what is being done, because this week the so-called Digital Services Act, a draft of it was published at the same time the Digital Markets Act. Then there is the AI strategy that is in the making. There is a Data Governance Act that has been proposed. In addition, there is a Democracy Action Plan that is involved in all these discussions when you're looking from the perspective of disinformation. And of course, you have all the discussions that are going on about questions of competition. Where there's also legislative action, but also action on the litigation side. The European Commission trying to be more aggressive towards large platforms. So, I mean, Algorithm Watch, of course, I enjoy being complimented on our work, but at the same time, we need to remain realistic. Our organization basically has been around for 4 years, and we are 16 people. And we can't monitor all this that is going on at the same time. So we also need to focus. And at the moment, we are focusing on this transparency issue on these two sides. First of all, we are asking the legislator to think about these public registers to make the use of these things more transparent, but also at the same time to push for better access to data. And at the moment, we are focusing, for organizational reasons, on information intermediaries, on platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and so on. But of course, there's a tremendous importance in platforms like Uber and Amazon and Airbnb and other, click working organizations or platforms, because then you have all the issues of, for example, labor laws, which is also something that we are addressing. And I'll give you this as an example, because I think, I could try to describe in broad strokes what is going on in the US, for example, but it doesn't, I think it doesn't really make sense if you don't try to break it down on a concrete case. So what the European Union suggested in the white paper on artificial intelligence is the so-called risk-based approach to addressing problematic implications or implementations of artificial intelligence-based systems. So they are thinking about a structure or criteria to define what could be a risky system and what is not a risky system, and then try to find out how to address this. Now, first of all, we think it is problematic. I mean, we don't have an answer in the sense of there's a better approach to this. The risk-based approach, of course, is somehow risky in the sense that it could fail to address some systems that are just not seen to pose a certain risk, but then when they're implemented, they still do. Because we have discussed today with a lot of cases and examples of how people fail to see where the risk actually is. But leaving this aside, you know, you also need to focus on what is there and what you can make use of. The white paper then proposes that, or states rather, that all systems that are used in connection with workers and employment are deemed high risk anyways, you know, so recruiting, automated HR, and so on and so forth. Now, what we're trying is to use this as an opportunity and say, well, if that's the case, and the paper already defines that there need to be increased transparency requirements there, then let's take them by their word and say, if you've already proposed this, then what we need as the next thing, for example, is more transparency about algorithmic systems that deal with workers in the entire EU. Now, is that going to be successful? We have no clue, but the opportunity here is that right now, labor law in the European Union is not very well harmonized. You know, everyone is doing their own thing. So when we are looking for opportunities for horizontal legislation here that could increase our knowledge and therefore also our agency when it comes to these systems, there's an opportunity here. Now, as I said, you know, in the end, will we be successful? I have no idea, but this is what we are trying to do because at the moment we are not doing strategic litigation, which I'd love to do, but there hasn't just been an opportunity. We are not focused on this as an organization. We need to collaborate with others on this, and there also needs to be funding. But we are looking at these legislative processes, and there we are trying to identify where there's an opportunity to increase the level of transparency, and then hopefully at later steps to identify the, let's say, substantive problems and also address them. So of course, transparency is never a means and an end in itself. It can always only be a basis for further action. I hope this at least partly answers the question.
No, perfect. Thank you. And I think I personally and everyone here should thank Divij for getting together this really excellent panel. I mean, because I think every panelist has like similar experiences, but also, I mean, ones that are different based on context and the role that you all play. And it's been really fascinating for me, and I'm sure everyone else to observe and learn from this. It's definitely been one of the most interesting sort of Zoom webinars I've been a part of. So I know that we are coming to the end, and Brinda, great that you're back. I know that you have to leave soon. We're also a little bit over time. So if I can ask everyone to just stay for maybe 5 minutes more, if that's fine, to answer some quick audience questions. If that's fine with everyone, if you can just give me a thumbs up, if you can stay for 5 minutes more. Yeah. So Vrinda, actually, I think there's one question that I think you're perfectly suited to answer, which is from the live stream. Actually, we've been conducting the YouTube live stream. So the question is, I conducted autoethnographic research working as a food delivery worker to closely understand data use and algorithmic control within gig work platforms. What rights and protection do workers and researchers like me have in revealing specificities of algorithms seeking accountability from these systems they work under? So it appears that there was some ethnographic research conducted, and it's very interesting research to actually work, I suppose, as a food delivery worker. What the question is, what rights and protections do workers and researchers have in this context? I think, Brinda, if you can answer this, that'll be great, and anyone else can chip in as well.
Yeah, I actually think right now, at least our framework, our legal framework is not really designed to actually deal with any of these things. So I think the problem is there's no real governing law. You obviously have the Information Technology Act, which is, we don't have a national data protection legislation. We obviously only have the Information Technology Act, which doesn't apply to governments or to independent research, NGOs or research organizations. So that's, it only applies to corporates. So I think that's one issue in terms of where you would fall under. I think some of it would also be governed by the terms of service or the privacy policies of those platforms and what they talk about. I just think this is, it's a great question, because I think no one is even thinking along those lines right now in India. It just shows that we have this absolute bare minimal legal framework. So actually, I think at this stage, it would really depend also on the particular algorithms and kind of what those terms of service are and how, those companies may kind of react. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's a clear answer to the question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vrinda. I know that, I think Matthias just said that he needs to leave as well. So there is actually one more question. Unfortunately, I think because we've been taking questions in the chat, might not get time to actually interact with the audience. But there is one more question for everyone. And before people leave, if they can answer this quickly. I think this is, Setu is asking about Siri and asking about the example of how this process propagated inequalities. The question he's asking is, can someone explain a little bit more about how automated decision making directly leads to greater economic inequality? So whether we use the example of Siri or any other algorithmic process, does anyone want to take this question?
Well, one of the issues is the echo chamber effect. So the data that's being used to feed systems might contain biases by itself. And then it reinforces, I think Corey has also mentioned it, right, in her A-levels case. The algorithm reinforces the already existing biases.
Yeah, I think that sums up. And of course, for Setu as well, there's a lot of work that's been done, a lot of excellent research that's been done on this. Of course, in the Indian context, please look at Vidushi's work, who was there in the previous panel. And then, of course, in other contexts, there's work by Virginia Eubanks, who's written a book called Automating Inequality, which I think is useful in that regard. I think we have time for one more, maybe quick question from the audience.
I think Matthias wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, if there's another question, I will.
No, there isn't actually. There isn't. So we can just end on this note. Thanks, Vrinda, for pointing out. Thanks.
Okay, so first of all, I'm really sorry. I need to leave on time, so I only have 2 more minutes. But one attempt as an answer here as well is, if we take into view the more broader implications of this, that these things that we're talking about are always socio technological systems and not technologies just in itself, that are not connected to the wider context. And when trying to answer this question about economics and economic situation is also, why are they used for these purposes? Why are they always used, for example, to detect welfare fraud or to, to monitor people who are receiving transfer payments and so on and so forth? Why are they not used for other purposes? And of course, what always comes to mind is tax abuse or tax evasion and things like this. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are used in the right way. There also always needs to be control over that. But in the broader picture, there is a clear indication that they are always, first of all, experimented with on, let's say, vulnerable or marginalized communities. And there is little evidence that they are used to address other problems that we face in society that they could be used for as well.
In the Siri court hearing, I asked the court, why is Siri only used in neighborhoods with poorer people? Because if you go to the rich neighborhoods, you might find much more money. Can the state please answer that question? No, they really couldn't. And then I thought the court was quite, convinced.
Wonderful. So any final thoughts on this question or otherwise from any of the panelists? Otherwise, I'll hand it back to Divij for closing thoughts. Anyone? I think the conversation was so exciting. We didn't have time for detailed audience Q&A, but I really enjoyed myself. So thank you to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts. It was, as I said, one of the most fascinating panels I've witnessed. So that was great. If there are no further thoughts, then
can I just say one super quick thing? Just
there is, please.
I'm a new and small organization, but I really I couldn't be happier that you've done this, because I think that international comparing of notes and actually kind of collaborating on projects, like I already do Anton, but I don't know all of you. And I would just encourage people who are working on anything like platform work of justice or algorithmic accountability to kind of drop us a line, because we're really interested in kind of teaming up and building a proper kind of international movement of folks on this. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Corey. Sorry, I hope I've not missed anyone else. Anyone else? Divij?
I mean, I have a lot to say about that, but I think that we're running out of time, and just, I just wanted to kind of close on that note and just express my gratitude for all of you to taking time off and contributing to this so meaningfully. I definitely think, building on what Corey said, that there is both a space for and an absolutely critical need to build international solidarity on these issues. One of the reasons that I also did some of this research was to indicate that technology that's being built in very different contexts is kind of being imported into the systems that we see in use in India, in public agencies in India. And that we need a diversity of actors and a diversity of voices to make these meaningful changes. We need to get this perspectives from different places out to the standardization committees, to the committees or the technologists who are designing this, to the lawmakers in other parts of the world who are designing for this. I mean, one example is just how influential GDPR has been to developing data protection law around the world. And I think that's one really interesting way in which I think cross-border collaboration and solidarity can also kind of help people across the world. And yeah, with that note, I'm so grateful that you could join, and also so thankful for the great work that you've been doing in this issue. I really hope that we can keep pushing for this, keep kind of making this network stronger, kind of educating people, lawmakers, bureaucrats, people on the ground, and other lawyers to kind of engage with this more meaningfully. And yeah, with that, thank you and have a good day. Bye. Thanks everyone for joining again. And if you have any questions about my project, please feel free to drop me a line. My information is on the project website. I'll drop the link here again. And do have a click through and see. I'm happy to respond to any comments, critiques, additions to this. And yeah, have a happy new year. Bye. And thanks, Arindrajit, of course, so much. Your moderation was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Divij. I just wanted to stay back to say thanks. It was a fantastic event.
Thanks to Hasgeek as well. Thanks for organizing this and providing all the support. Really grateful.
And I mentioned this in the chat, but my colleague Pranav, who's been working with us from the beginning to set this up. So yeah, so thanks everyone. Thank you.